Welcome to Magic Arcanum. I'm Ryan Gomez. Behind the scenes is Nicole Letson, and we are so glad you're here because it's story time. Preview season for Ikoria Lair of Behemoths has just begun, and the set promises to be full of huge creatures. So we thought it would be fun to take a look back at some of the biggest ones Magic has ever had. But first, let me say a quick thank you to everyone who helps make this show possible with their support on Patreon. You can become a lore mage and get your name in the credits using the link down below, as well as unlocking some extra goodies like access to our exclusive Discord server and the ability to vote on upcoming episodes. Okay, so what is the history of really big creatures? How big is really big? Anyway, to answer that, we're going to go all the way back to 1993 and look at the game's first chonker, as Nicole put it. That would be Force of Nature, an 8/8 for just 6 mana, which at the time was way better than anything else you could get for that rate. Now notice, he does have a downside. Every upkeep you have to pay 4 green mana or he punches you in the throat. But that still is not bad as far as early really big creatures go, and that will be the benchmark by which we measure everybody else. Now, you might expect that the early big creatures were all concentrated in green, being that it's supposed to be the color of really big creatures, but no. Oh no. For the first few years of Magic, it was actually blue that led the way in big creatures, and that's mostly thanks to their abundant sea monsters. Island fish Gisconius from Arabian Nights established that blue could get really big creatures if it was willing to accept the ridiculously high prices attached to them, and this guy had a bigger downside than Force of Nature did. Force of Nature only held his record as biggest creature until Colossus of Sardia hit the scene in Antiquities, which gave a deck of any color a really big creature because it was an artifact. Blue then answered back with Leviathan, a massive sea monster and the first creature in the game to be printed with double-digit power and toughness. The game is barely a year old at this point and we're already into double digits. Yeah! Did Blue rest there? Nope. Take a look at Polar Kraken from Ice Age, which cranks it up to 11, literally. And take a look at these drawbacks. They're getting ridiculous. This is also the highest converted mana cost we're going to see for a long time, but we're not there yet. First, we need to head to Mirage, home of the Phyrexian Dreadnought, another record breaker, and owner of possibly the worst drawback we've seen yet amongst the really big creatures. It's interesting to me that at this point in Magic design, they are still so scared of creatures being potentially overpowered that they keep attaching these ridiculous penalties to what is probably already the most expensive spell in your deck. Fortunately, that's about to change, though. Kind of. Avatar of Might from Prophecy is the first creature that's at least as big as Force of Nature with no drawback. None. Just a straight up 8/8 with trample. In fact, it even gets cheaper to cast if your opponent has you outnumbered. Now, power and toughness is a great way to decide who is the biggest creature, but you could also argue mana cost is another good way to determine it. And if you use that for your yardstick, the winner is Draco from Planeshift. That's a record that still stands today, but it might be broken with Ikoria Lair of Behemoths. Anyway, back to power and toughness because we are about to surpass the record holder Phyrexian Dreadnought with the 13/13 Krosan Cloud Scraper. And we are back to having drawbacks on our really big creatures. Great, just great. Darksteel gives us the aptly named Darksteel Colossus, who does not break any new records himself, but he is the forerunner to another card that I want to talk about later. So I'm going to put him on screen here for a second. Plus, Colossus is like my favorite of the X-Men. So, there you go, a little bit of trivia for you. Champions of Kamigawa had some interesting creatures to be sure, but I want to draw your attention to Kuro Pitlord, because he is the first legendary creature in the game who can beat our old friend Force of Nature in a one-on-one fight. I like to think he was at the gym every day for the 11 years in between these two cards being released. So now that Magic has been around for over 10 years, designs are starting to change, and we're starting to see some seeds planted that will pay off in future sets. This worm from our first visit to Ravnica is a good example of what I mean. He does not break any records by himself right now, but he establishes that this plane is home to some impressive wildlife, and that will be relevant later. The game is also old enough to have some fun with callbacks. Check out this Leviathan from Cold Snap, a spiritual successor to the original Polar Kraken from Ice Age. Cold Snap had a few other goodies in it. There was Panglacial Wurm, a very big creature that you could cast from your library while searching it, and it also gave us Dark Depths, a land that could produce a 2020 creature token. That 2020 would technically be the biggest creature to date, but since it's a token and not really a card you can put into your deck, I'll let you decide if it counts. Bold Wire Heavyweights from Morningtide put a fun twist on the really big creature with a downside thing. Hopefully you don't play it against a green deck that is packing Panglacial Wurm. Now we come to Alara, a plane split into 5 shards and home to a conflux of raw mana. As you might expect, that gives us some very big creatures like Godsire, Hellkite Overlord, and Fusion Elemental. Those guys are nothing compared to Progenesis, though, who is the first really big creature to look really big. I mean, compare him to Skyshroud Behemoth, who is also a 10/10, but he's only like 1 tree tall, and Progenesis is like 5 trees tall easily. There is a joke in here about how many trees high is Progenesis, but I'll let you write it. Anyway, Zendikar, another plane that is home to some really big creatures. You've got Lorthos the Tidemaker, a boss of a legendary creature who has 8s everywhere. You've got Terra Stomper, who is a strictly better version of Force of Nature, like, whoa. You've got Death's Shadow, which is a modern powerhouse, even though it's never really a 13/13. You've got Terastodon, which is a commander format staple. And you've got Rexel the Risen Deep, best friends with Lorthos and my commander of choice. And we haven't even gotten to the Eldrazi yet. You can't talk about really big creatures without mentioning the Eldrazi. And the biggest among them updates our record. Emrakul, Ulamog, and Kozilek are some of the most powerful singular creatures in all of Magic. Even their offspring, like Ulamog's Crusher, is a Pauper format staple for reanimation strategies and Tron decks. It's going to be tough to unseat the Eldrazi as champions of the really big creatures, but we can do it. We're just going to take a look at a few more fun ones along the way. Stormtide Leviathan from M11 harkens back to the OG Leviathan, but this guy has like no downsides. And guess who's in my Rexel commander deck? Mirrodin Besieged gave us Blightsteel Colossus, a twisted version of his Darksteel brother, and that 1 extra mana to pay for Infect, totally worth it. Meanwhile, over on Innistrad, things are also getting dark as they leaned into their theme of fearing the number 13, with cards like Ludwig's Test Subject, Tree of Redemption, and Elbrus the Binding Blade, all touching on Triskaidekaphobia. Then we returned to Ravnica, where Worldspine Wurm tied Emrakul's record at a whopping 15/15 and continued the tradition of this plane having really big worms. But we're not done yet. On Pharos, we got to look at the gods, who appeared really big, but stat-wise, they really aren't. We also had the monstrous ability, which could make creatures huge, but many of them did not start out that way. I did like Colossus of Akros, though, as a sort of callback to Colossus of Sardia. Then we had Tromocratus, another in a steadily growing line of really big blue sea monsters. And Bearer of the Heavens put its own fun twist on the drawbacks usually attached to those very big creatures of old. Over on Tarkir, we had plenty of dragons, but most of them were pretty small. The only exception was Dragonlord Atarka, who had as much as 3 points over the power or toughness of her weaker siblings. That's fine though, because it makes our return to Zendikar all the more impressive with new versions of Ulamog and Kozilek. They aren't quite as powerful as their original cards, but with Aetherworks Marvel in Standard, didn't really matter. Eldritch Moon was hiding the missing Eldrazi Titan, Emrakul. So we got a new version of her, now a 13/13, because that had kind of become Innistrad's thing, and you can see that as well with Tree of Perdition. The set also gave us Brizella, Voice of Nightmares, a horrible amalgamation of two corrupted angels. This might be physically the biggest of the really big creatures, because it's made of two singular cards melded together on the battlefield. Razaketh is a fun one, because up until now, most of the demons in Magic had been 6/6, maybe 7/7, but old Raspberry here knows how to throw his weight around, so good for him. We're in the home stretch now as we come to Ixalan, best known for its island full of dinosaurs. Some of them were really big creatures, especially the elders like Galta, Zetalpa, and Zakama. Then we can swing by Dominaria and say hello to Slyn Voda, the latest in a very long line of proud leviathans. Aggressive Mammoth from M19 brings us pretty much full circle. He is strictly better than the original Force of Nature and shows us just how much creatures have changed in 25 years of Magic design. And that leaves us with the current record holder amongst the really big creatures. Impervious Great Worm, the Guilds of Ravnica Buy a Box promo, dethroned Emrakul and reminded us once again the wurms on this plane are not to be messed with. From an 8/8 with an upkeep cost to an indestructible 16/16, Magic has had a history of really big creatures. But you know what? There's a few more I still want to talk about, so we're going to use a segment I call Mustache Minute. Ready? Here we go. Endless Worm from Urza's Saga. This guy didn't break any records, but he does have probably the best flavor text among all of the really big creatures. Oh, you thought I forgot about silver bordered cards, right? But I did not. I usually don't mention them in these types of videos, but as a young lad, I did open both halves of BFM from Unglued. I had just gotten home from my local card store. I'm hanging out in my living room with my two best friends and my younger brother, and we're all ripping open our packs, and I try to calmly ask everyone if they have any extra swamps, because up until that point, I had only played white and red decks. After getting a bunch of flat no's, I got back on my bike and headed to the game store again, where they happily sold me 20 4th edition swamps for 15 cents a piece. Then I pedaled back home, and out of breath at this point, I tried to build my first mono black deck. Guess what? It sucked. Anyway, Infinity Elemental is another silver bordered card that technically is a really big creature, but it illustrates another fear I have for Ikoria. The bigger your power is, the less it really matters, because it either just gets chump blocked or you kill your opponent in like one hit. So how are they going to make all of these really big creatures on Ikoria matter? Because they can't all have trample or flying, right? Hey, check out the art for Supreme Exemplar. Look at this frog face in here. He makes Yargle so jealous. And yes, Yargle could probably also be counted as a really big creature, but I used toughness of 8 or more as my measuring stick, because otherwise we'd have to include Force of Savagery. And now we're just being silly. Quick shout out to my boy Metalwork Colossus. He could be a 10/10 for 0, and he's pretty much the Megazord of Kaladesh. And I'm sorry, but I am still hung up on the size thing. Crater Hoof Behemoth is towering over the trees, and he's only a 5/5. But Ancient Brontodon is like, hey, do you bring any snacks? Also, gotta toss Segovian Leviathan in here. Segovia is a plane where everything is really tiny, so even their giant sea monster is barely bigger than an elephant. Alright, here's one more. Primeval Protector. He looks about right for a 10/10, yeah? What do you think? Which really big creature has the most appropriately sized art? Let me know down in the comments. Then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the great stories you'll only find here on Magic Arcanum. We'll see you.